ownership probably cares more about net income. Now, there is obviously a relationship, just like revenue to net income, but it's not the same. And so having the same goal number and everybody agreeing to what that goal number is really important.
The goal for Ryan is to establish, the variables, the key variables, if they're not already clear, and then what kind of ratios are we wanting to orient around. It certainly doesn't have meaning, like you said, if we don't manage to it.
The more transparent you can be with your vendors, the better service you're going to get. Welcome to the Digible Dudes podcast. I'm David.
I'm Reid.
All right, Reid, we are here to talk about budgeting. It's your favorite season. Do you have that like on the little refrigerator calendar at home? Like Miranda's planning kids' summer camps, and then she says, "Oh shoot, budgeting season hits." Yeah.
Not yet, but I probably should. Of course, it's always been a moving target for us, which is, I'm sure, going to be a big part of this discussion. But just when is it really budgeting season? Is it always budgeting season? Or should it always be budgeting season versus the way this is typically approached? And we're going to air it out, as far as how we go about it here at Digible and see if we can draw some parallels and also some probably clear distinctions between what that looks like for the industry we serve versus, our own company. But yeah. I mean, I see it, and not to jump right in, but as an important, touchstone reference, to know how well you really know your business. But yeah, I mean, this day and age, regardless of your industry, things are so dynamic, which begs the question, has the way that it's always been done, the way that it should be, continue to be done, which is the theme of our summit. A shameless plug there, but we'll be talking about rethinking and unlearning, and this is one area when we get into the marketers and operators and how they work together. How does budgeting fit into that?
Mm-hmm. Let me ask, what was your experience at other companies? Like before this industry, when were they starting budgeting season?
I've had a pretty unusual blend of fiscal versus calendar, and so that certainly changed things significantly. But it would usually be about 90 to 120 days out before you had to tie the knot on it. Doesn't mean that bumped up to December 31st, but it was like whatever, the timeline was. And I guess you are asking me that too. But let's just say in the media companies I was at, we were mostly on calendar. Funny enough, I say that, and we were on fiscal at DFM. But it'd be okay, November, before Thanksgiving. It's we don't want to be talking about this. Nobody's even going to be here in December anyways. And so if that's the timeline, when do we start? And it was usually, again, 90 to 120 days out.
So you guys might say Thanksgiving's on the 28th. So we need 90 days before that we start budgeting, and it must be completed by the 28th.
Yep. Yeah. You just back into the deadline. And similar to what we're going to probably be doing here at Digible, everybody just wanted to see that very first pass almost more than anything. It's just let's see the bones of this, but also appreciating the fact, which you've called out a few times, how much just in 90 days is going to change. And so trying to leave yourself room, if you will, to make modifications based on what does take place, in the last quarter of the year. But you should be able to get the foundation set in the first few weeks, and then you're tinkering and tinkering and tinkering unless something significant happens until you get to a point where everybody's really bought in, had a chance to contribute.
And was your experience where you guys were provided, here's basically updated based on last year, and then you have to modify and give your seal of approval for each department, or was it you start from scratch and then it rolls up?
I was fortunate, I'll say, at least in the last role that I was in, where I was more part of that, not just being told, here's what you did last year, here's what we need you to do this year, and figure it out, which might surprise you. But there was also plenty of that, so it was CFO saying, here's what we're seeing, here are the trends, so this is what I think are fair assumptions to make. And then I had a chance to agree, disagree, but typically, trends are there for a reason, right? It does show you what things look like in the here and now. And so, and when you're dealing with larger numbers, right, it's less likely to move, but each point is significant. So don't be fooled by that, where it's 10% seems reasonable. It's well, yeah, on $150 million, that's pretty significant,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but if it's on $100,000, you know, 10% is easy to digest.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to make sure that you're keeping all that in perspective going into that stuff.
And then fiscal versus calendar. What did you like about either? What did you dislike?
I'm a calendar guy. I thought fiscal was a little weird, but that also drew me in, you know, because it wasn't something I was accustomed to. I want to say when I was at GSK, like in pharma, that they were on fiscal too. And I can't recall. I wish I could, but what was the reasoning and, you know, why also. I think the reasoning for it staying there is just like how much to unravel, especially if it was a whole media company versus just like one market. So I don't know what determined that up front, but yeah, I'm a calendar guy. Just call it the convenience of it. Just easy to orient around. And then when you think about the, you know, Q1, Q2, 3, Q4, you know, just simplified things for me.
When you said the unraveling, did you ever know the story of like Kodak's calendar?
No, but I think you might be about to tell me.
Yeah, I don't remember all the nuances of this, but basically, like Kodak back in the day was so like influential across the globe, and they, for accounting reasons, wanted to do. They didn't like the calendar that like the U.S. or the world operates by, so they had a 13-month calendar, and they were so influential that all of their vendors started operating off of this, or most of their vendors started operating off the same 13-month calendar. So they all had a separate Kodak calendar for like these 13 months and when they hit and when they fall and all this
Wow,
stuff. So
that is nuts.
that'd be a fun like episode to dive into more.
It's a little like daylight savings, right?
Yeah, so it's 13 months. There are 28 days in each month. And they used it until 1989.
Amazing.
Yeah, pretty awesome. So I just think one day, you always talk about Digible's purpose is to have influence in the industry. Well, maybe we pick up the 13-month calendar.
All right. We'll be checking in 5 years from now.
Yeah. Well, for the fiscal versus calendar, I don't know that I've met a property yet that does fiscal. It's like every time I talk to a property management company or an individual owner, it is always calendar. And, you know, I'm just speculating here, but it's got to be because of the tax implications and how they need to stay on.
Yep.
But then you could argue that even for DFM, for example, like, do you know their reasoning why they went to fiscal?
No, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, because that's still, you still have to handle taxes regardless if you move to fiscal.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so Digible, just giving a little history, in the early days, you were building budgets yourself, and then eventually when we got Ryan here, he took those over and started to do more annual planning. It's not that you didn't annually plan before, but before Ryan got here, we were cash flow was so important to us that I feel like you were just basically every week updating this.
It's not every day. I remember telling you that. I was in our bank account literally every night.
Yeah.
Yep. So
and then when Ryan got here, not that cash flow wasn't still important, but he just moved it more back to, okay, we're going to do this annual plan. Mm-hmm. And then he still monitors cash flow and does month-end closes and things. But last year we did our plan, and then we started to fall off of our plan just from what our projections were. And some of the friction we'd had was, okay, now that Digible, I think he started working on that budget last year in August or September.
Yeah, about the same time. Yeah. That's where we're at today.
Yeah, and then wanted to have it out for next year. And my gripe was we're growing so fast, like things are adapting so fast. What is going to change based on budget, or what are we willing to change based on budget? So that's where I've had some, I guess, gripes along the way. What should we be doing if we're ahead or if we're behind, and how should that adjust? Because there are times where we're beating out revenue forecast, and so we need to hire more people. And some discussion from Ryan will be like, well, that wasn't in the budget. It's like, yeah, because we're ahead of revenue, and then vice versa, right? Obviously, if we fall behind revenue forecast, we probably don't need to hire as quickly. And yet some of the departments may feel like, well, I was supposed to hire in May, so they start hiring in May, and then that causes Ryan some heartburn. So those are some of the challenges we've dealt with. Is there anything else there that, I don't know, that you want to cover that historically?
I don't know about historically. I'm eager for you to recall what you can from the summit in 2019, because you ran a workshop on budgeting that I thought was very spirited, very fun and interesting to see, with all these different marketers across a lot of different companies, right? PMCs, institutional, how they went about it. So But for ourselves and just generally speaking, doing it earlier. And I'm not like some hard advocate of that. I do like getting a look at it earlier, but I think the goal for Ryan is to establish, the variables, the key variables, if they're not already clear, and then what kind of ratios are we wanting to orient around. It certainly doesn't have meaning, like you said, if we don't manage to it, but that's something that you can, use the trends, get a look at, and say, are we still comfortable with gross margin range of this, or an EBITDA of that, or of our dues and subs here? And really, that is key for his role and for the success of the company. Because if you just acknowledge like, hey, we're in super high growth, things are moving super fast, it's always going to be changing, that makes it super hard for him or anybody to really put some controls in place, manage, according to what's going on. If you just kind of have your hands up, it's like we're on a rocket ship, so let's just, each week we'll check in. I think he has to find the balance, and that is hard when you got a company that, at least in our case, has doubled, our revenue in the last year. Fortunately, not quite doubled our expenses, but we've added 4 new departments. There's a lot more to keep his eyes on than there has been before, and so he does have to, again, acknowledge that, but still is trying to create some sort of controls and ratios and key variables that we can all orient around.
Yeah, I'd say what we've done a good job of this year is he's forcing questions like, what can we agree on from a net income or EBITDA perspective we will never go below? And then what, as far as anything above that net income number, then what do we agree to do with it? And so you have to set these first principles. Otherwise, we're always going to be asking the question over and over again. So I think he started to get those first principles down. I think where we've struggled is what he wants to present to us, in our next meeting, but he wants to present what do we do if we're overstaffed for how long? So if Digible does overhire, do we do anything about it or leave it, or at what point? And not that we're in this there right now. It's like we're trying to answer these questions ahead of ever having this situation happen. If we overhire or underhire, and same thing with missing budget. So you and I used to sort of not reminisce, but I don't know, just sometimes over like nachos or something, the fact that like the Post was really all about top line revenue. That's all they championed. And so David might go sell some search, but then you're getting beat up about net income. And it's like, well, search isn't our revenue doesn't equal net income. And so there are different margins of products. And so if we're incentivizing the sales team off of top line revenue, they will give you top line revenue. But if now everyone else, management, is being bonused on net income, then that's a different story. So it's more having alignment with those numbers. And I think that's something, again, that apartments could really do a better job of too, because there are marketing departments where all they are focused on is occupancy, because it pops up as on their red hot report or whatever because of an occupancy number, but not because of net income. And yet ownership probably cares more about net income. Now there is obviously a relationship, just like revenue to net income, but it's not the same. And so having the same goal number and everybody agreeing to what that goal number is really important.
I'll take it one step further, and everybody being compensated based on that end goal. Because I know for a fact my compensation was not, the same as my peers, like on that operating committee at the Post, and even with the CEO, which to me, at least half of my comp should have lined up with everyone else at that table. And so that creates a huge conflict, right? As far as what I'm focused on, what I'm promoting, like within my department versus somebody next to me. There's something else that you mentioned. It'll come back to me. We can keep going.
Well, I think it was Buffett, and I'll summarize his quote, but what I had heard, what I remember him being attributed was, show me the incentive and I'll tell you the outcome. But basically he's just saying like incentives will produce outcome for better or worse, right? So that's why you have to be very careful about what those incentives are, so that you don't have any departments that end up causing conflict with one another.
Yep, totally.
So I think like the other thing that's surprising to me, and I'd love to talk to one of the owners, one of our ownership listeners or something on this topic, but as you were mentioning, you were given 90 days basically to do budgeting with prior experience at other organizations. And that usually was backed out from Thanksgiving, as you're saying, if it was calendar, for example. In apartments, I hear about people talking about it in July. So why why is it done so far in advance? Because as any prediction, the further you're predicting out, the less likely it is to be true, right? With certainty. Like, it's different if you're like, hey, we're going to have generalized AI sometime this century. Sure. Okay. More likely to be true then because of how I'm saying this century. But when you're trying to say in July of next year, what are we going to do? What are going to be our move outs when we haven't even closed July of this year? It's very confusing to me. So do you want to just like speculate about why it might be done so early?
I'm gonna say probably the life cycle of buildings and the budgets that comprise those, have to be thought about much further out in advance than what at least I would have you know been expected from like with media and with advertising and things like that. I'm careful not to go even much further than that, but it just when you're talking about development or especially stabilized properties, it just seems like there's a need, and unstabilized maybe it's just the opposite. I don't know. I really don't have a great answer for that. It just seems like when it comes to buildings that there's a longer life cycle as it relates to budgeting.
Yeah, my best guess on this, it's the typical game of telephone as I view it. So you have let's say the end owner that doesn't want to manage the building, so they pass it off to a property management company, and the property management company is like, well, I need the on-site property manager to obviously do the budgeting, right? And so if each of those have to have 90 days to do their budgeting before they pass it on to the next person, you're like 6 to 9 months or whatever in front of things, because you want to give the property manager time to pull together, gather all the resources, the management company to review and say totally or not, and then the ownership group itself needs to know what their budgets are going to be next year and maybe push back and push it all the way back down the chain. So this crazy game of telephone, which then, if that is true, it makes me wonder, like, who is culpable, right? Because it's the whole, like, who actually owns budgeting in that process if it's three different folks. What makes it even more annoying for the management company itself is the fact that, like, they don't typically have one owner that has 100 buildings with them, right? It's like every building has a different owner, because as we know, even ownership groups want to spread their assets around to different companies. And so can you imagine, it's like you have, like, Reid would be like, let's say you run a region or something. Now you have 50 properties underneath you. It's like you're dealing with 50 different Ryans that are saying, hey, here's the way I want to see my budgeting. Here's the way I want to see my budgeting. Or, hey, I want to see it like plus 5% or whatever. It seems insane, frankly.
Yeah, it's giving me stress just hearing you say all that. The theory, and it may be a really good one, that it's a game of telephone and it's just this domino, effect that has to take place to get to the end. It would be crazy to me, but doesn't mean that it's not a reality. I say that because the author of that budget, I'm going to use the CFO, if he allows some key part, right, of division of the company to start in March or in April or something, and then waits and then moves on to the next division, you can bet, and maybe he just looks and says, hey, I'm starting with you because the least will change. That would be smart, right? But most likely there's going to be change all along the way. And so it's supposed to be a collaborative process that I think should happen inside of 30 days, not over the course of 6 to 9 months, for all the reasons you're describing. There's way better chance that's going to be accurate than, if you have this kind of staggered, like, by department, and honestly, my experience was just that. Like, at the Post and everywhere I can remember, we never had one division of the company starting way in advance of everybody else. It was like, we could never do that. That'd be like writing a book and having eight different authors and nobody knows what the plot is. It's like, it would be ridiculous.
Right. If you don't give, like, next year we want to go from 100 million to 120 million. If you don't give that directive in June going into budgeting in July, how can you possibly expect anybody to do it accurately? And I think that's part of, like, what the breakdown I think is that I've seen with typical budgeting, and then we can talk again about ourselves. But even with ourselves, I know Ryan was just asking, hey, should we move budgeting back even further? Or maybe it's annual planning back even further, so he's got more time to do the budget. And I can understand that, because he needs to be given, in 24, we want to hit this target. and now help us build a budget around hitting that target. But obviously part of the way we also want to set the target is saying, what are you seeing right now for so it's this whole chicken and the egg.
It really is
insanity. The other thing with it is, now let's say the budget's set and you fall off track. What do you do about it? Because you and I have worked with many different properties at this point, and management companies where they have a budget and they'll say, well, I gave marketing a budget of $96,000 this year divided by 12. And you just get even split throughout the year. This is what the session was about in the first Digible Summit. But that doesn't make sense, right? I think you always say, like, if it's a jeweler, do you advertise for Valentine's or do you not advertise for Valentine's? Because Valentine's is a busy time of year, so maybe you don't need to advertise. Whereas the other school of thought is it's Valentine's, so you should advertise to capitalize on all the search. So the same with apartments. When you take 96,000 divided by 12, now you just have that $8,000 a month that you're splitting evenly, but yet there's clearly peak leasing season, and clearly you have a rent roll. So why would your budget be evenly split throughout the year? And that's the message for the first 5 years of the company. We were really pushing is, like, do not just divide by 12. This doesn't make sense. Give at least some, pick a side, advertise for Valentine's or don't, and build your budget around that. Because then when they do fall off track, many times in the middle of the year, they'll say, hey, we're off track of our budget. Get us more leads, but no more budget, right? And okay, how do you expect more lead? Like, you just say it, so more leads will happen. And a lot of times their answer is like, well, we'll give concessions, which is fine. That's fine. That could be one way to maybe close more of those leads that you're getting. And it's only in Q4, from my experience, that now they'll say, okay, yep, we're way off track from that budget we wrote 15 months ago. We have to hit this mark this year. So whatever it takes, tell me. You want 10 grand? Great. We'll give you 10 grand. But that's weird, right? Because now it's like you're running up against the end of the year and you're just trying to blow it out, which is not efficient at all. You're just trying to hit this one mark. So it kind of becomes arbitrary. That, as I know you can respect also from your different positions, but what we also see is people that have been hoarding budget maybe until the last part of the year, and they're like, I better use this budget or I won't get it again next year. And so they just say, spend it however you want to spend it, just because I want to keep it. So do you have any commentary on that kind of behavior?
Well, just that I think the root cause of what you're describing, and even backing up a little bit further to just the budgeting in the summer, or even in Q2 for the following calendar year, is, and I'm not going to make it a personality thing. It's what they're asked to do, but is to mitigate risk. And so, Ryan included, it's like, as much as I can, I want to hold you to certain things, as we look ahead, so that I don't have any big surprises. And then at the same time, out of the other corner of his mouth, try and empower you, within that budget, so that that it can be fluid. But back to those ratios and formulas that he's built out, that we stay true to that, and then make decisions, which last year or this year, I guess we haven't been as committed to, because we felt good about our cash flow and our profits, that we've allowed ourselves a lot more room than maybe he's going to be advocating for next year, if we were to miss something. But there's a lot of I think anxiety about making significant changes even in the middle of the year as the business changes, because you're worried naturally that something could change that again, disrupt it. And so it's a very nerve-wracking situation to be in, where it's like, well, we're missing our budget, but it's only been 90 days. So do you keep going for another 90 days, or do you make a change and then find out that you were wrong and that you reacted too quickly? And so that's another big part of this is how long before you make those changes. And we talk in terms at Digible of just when does the clock start, but then you have the pipeline, right? And that has to also be similar to multifamily, where it's like, well, we just found out now that we have 3 more buildings or 10 deals, or we're churning. And how does that factor in, and how quickly can you react to that? Because I just know for ourselves, like, we just heard that today, that a bunch of leads that we weren't sure whether they were going to materialize came in hot last week. And then, how are we thinking about the staffing given the pipeline?
Yeah, I think we gave that advice in different sessions over the years, but basically, the more transparent you can be with your vendors, the better. The better service you're going to get,
Sure.
frankly.
Yeah.
I feel like there are a lot of folks who don't that sort of err on the side of not being transparent with the vendor, as if like the vendor is going to hold it against them or use it as a negotiating leverage point or something. But in reality, if you have something that requires human touch from a vendor, you should let your vendor know, like, hey, I have high confidence this is what's happening next year, or hey, we're not sure what's happening. We're still trying to work out budget. So it's not that it's December 25th and we don't want to give you the budget. It's just that we don't know yet. My gut tells me blop, and then that way your vendor can plan around it, because you don't do your vendor any. If you don't tell your vendor they're getting business, they won't be hiring up for it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you make a habit of not telling them, or not being accurate with what you're telling them, then they may make a habit of like, I'll wait to hire until until I know for sure I see the contract. And that's also not a great experience for you, because it takes so long to onboard these humans. And most of their vendors in this industry anyways do need some human element to it. Even if it's Yardi or Knock or whatever, you do have a customer support person tied to it. And the success of that system and rollout often depends on that support person. So I'm just advocating again, like, be very as transparent as you can, even if your transparency is, I don't know yet, here's my best guess. Yeah.
But tell that to the marketer that loses their budget when they don't spend it.
Yeah.
As far as transparency, you have to foster that, right? And especially, those operators, so that they, not to use psychological safety, but just have, the belief that they're not going to get somehow penalized for exposing the fact that maybe they have a little bit more budget. As long as everybody's on the same page, though, that shouldn't happen, right? Where it's like, I do understand if I have a little bit more budget that, I'm not going to be territorial about this. It may mean that it needs to go somewhere else or be paused or whatever. So you definitely want to make sure everybody's bought in. Rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, and I think, we've had many experiences where a property management company won't have their budgets actually signed off on until April of that year. So those first, 3.5 months of the year, we're operating under an understanding. Like, you're not going to...
kind of blind.
Yeah, exactly. And but they still want to run marketing even though the budget's not approved, which really doesn't help you have a culture of, now we're going to adhere to the budget, right? Like, you're just training your people that budget doesn't matter that much if you don't sign off in time.
One thing that I would love to see more from multifamily, and I don't know how many, I'll say, mavericks are out there listening or have tried to have this conversation with operators, but has anybody front loaded? And I talked to you about this many times, like even in a month. So as you talk about how flat things often look in this industry and us trying to support a more dynamic budget, and we started with occupancy, but then, we talk about NOI, then we talk about, peak leasing season, and, what should that heartbeat, if you will, that EKG kind of look like, an optimal one for the different use cases, from lease up to stabilized and all the other stuff. But I, kind of asked even further than that. It's like, well, within a given month, should that be evenly spent using search specifically, where it's like, well, I have 2,500 in search, and it's like, so are you going to spend whatever that is, $200 a day? Or what if the leads were there in the front half? Why wouldn't you spend it all up front? Or if you have $100,000 in advertising and marketing for the year, why not push as far as you can take it in the first 90 days? Because your goal, right, it's the inventory, especially on a lease up, is just sitting there. And so if my goal is to get there as fast as possible, why not max out my budget? Thinking in terms of impression share or any other kind of renter like demand, and then see how things go. And again, this gets into that whole financial, like, mitigate risk. That would just send out all sorts of like flare guns, fire, like for a CFO to hear that. But it could be a brilliant strategy,
Yeah, I love that you were saying if the goal, because that then says you have the goal. But let me ask you this. Let's say in January, Digible could onboard every new property for the year. Would you want to do that?
If in January we could onboard...
Yeah, you're basically saying, hey, if you could get all the leads at once, why not get all the leads at once?
No, I think it's fair to draw a pretty big distinction between us and a building, but I may be wrong. But if they had that scenario where they had 30 people ready to move in, what is that breaking point for, a standard, like a standard building?
Yeah. 30 people trying to use the elevator at once on the same day.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's not why they don't do that.
Yeah.
For them, it's more back to the controls and, just, I don't know if there's more to say than just about the controls, is they don't feel comfortable operating with that level of fluidity or kind of dynamic swings. And I can respect that, but I would still push to the limit. It's like, if we could successfully, with great experience, bring in 40 out of the 120 units we have in January, why wouldn't I do that?
Yeah, for them, a lot of it is rent roll. They try to get their rent roll to hit peak leasing season. They don't like it. Like if a building was going to open and it was delayed to opening into Q4 versus peak leasing season, they will try to get people to sign like a year and a half lease, for example, to try to get their rent roll lined up with peak leasing season, because they all want to be on peak leasing season.
Sure.
Back to your think different campaign, if you will. Part of me says though, like, yeah, then if the market's doing that, why don't you zig where they zag, and you now focus on, hey, we're the property that is available when you need to move in November. So I've heard different folks care about more of an even rent roll, but most that I talk to want everything available in peak leasing season. They will try to work with it. You might have a 14-month contract just so you can try to line back up with that rent roll. I do think there is something to the headcount problem, though. Like as we hear lead fatigue, you can't, if they're already lead fatigued all month, now say we're going to double your leads in the first 2 weeks, for example. It's even worse lead fatigue and worse end client experience because they don't get back to them in time. But I could see, instead of pacing, like most properties want pacing to be done on, like, hey, I just want to make sure I always spend $10 a day on marketing so that I have this even flow. Wouldn't it be interesting, back to that Maverick out there, where they're like, I want to get 6 leads a day. That's all I want. Turn it off after 6 leads, because I know my team can handle it with X confidence and X CSAT score. But if they get 10 leads a day, they start dropping the ball, and we make a bad client experience. So that would be a really interesting, I guess, experiment, is to do it on how many leads a day are you getting, and then that you can also then tell your team, like, you just got to handle 6 leads a day. You can't you do that? That would equal some uneven pacing, though, because to your point, you're going to have some days where you get a lot of natural leads, and so you don't need any paid campaigns happening.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Well, something we hear all the time, and we've been part of this pitch, with the emerging tech in multifamily and beyond, like just real estate. You hear all the time about time savings, meaning it's like, if you just use this tool, your marketer or your leasing agent or, your property manager will have this much more time on their hands. I feel like that's, when we say, can you handle 30 or 40, like, shouldn't that fit into this whole conversation? Like, where is the extra time being spent? So it's like, we made investments on, we're going to have Scott at like for Perk. It's like, now they're getting 70% of those conversations are happening like through the chatbot. So I'm now going to change my budget, assuming that you have more time, and we're going to be more aggressive in the beginning of the year.
Well, it's not unlike, we didn't mention this earlier, but previously Ryan was doing most budgeting in Google Sheets or Excel, just as you were, and it was about a year. Well, we're coming up on a year that he invested in Mosaic so that he could have something that was way more automated through budgeting. And our thought on that process is, hey, this will save it so that Ryan doesn't have to, like, when a question comes up in our executive meeting about making this investment, he doesn't have to like go away into the cave and come back, and then we have another question, he goes back to the cave. The idea is maybe he could also do it in person, like in the meeting, and say, hey, if we make that investment, I totally can predict a 5% lift in X, Y, and Z. We're not quite there yet. I mean, as all these systems, that they're super complex, so it takes a while to set up, and then if you have one little automation that's not working right, then it makes everybody not trust the numbers.
Right, exactly. So what do you recall from 2019? Anything stand out to you as far as after that workshop? What some of the differences were, or where you saw the most similarities? And then if we were to do that workshop again in a month, do you think that it would look more or less the same, or do you think there has been some, I'll call it advancements, some different approaches that are starting to take root?
Well,
in budgeting now?
the workshop we did in the first Digital Summit was we had a giant um, demand chart up on the wall, and that chart was saying the scenario was you have a lease up, and we're starting from 0% occupancy, but it opens on January 1st. You can start taking units, and by the end of the year, you want to be at 95% occupancy. Now, everybody was given a certain number of sticky notes, and each sticky note was basically
right?
$1.
Oh, okay.
Right. That is like here's $1,000, and then put your sticky notes in which month of the year you want to spend this on marketing. And we broke the entire summit up into groups. I think we had like 8 or 9 groups.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just say, for example, that everybody had 24 sticky notes. Then, do you see that those sticky notes are evenly split across the year, where it's $2,000 every month, 2 sticky notes every month? Or do you see it so that it goes with the jeweler example, where during peak leasing seasons they spend more to get their lease up done? And the common theme that I saw is everybody looks scared. Like when I first passed, I said, "Here's your thing," because you also had to do it in front of everybody, meaning every group was going to present what they were doing and why they were doing it, and it became very clear very quickly how intimidating this is, and how everyone, maybe many people have insecurities about like their methodology when it comes into budgeting, and that's super fair. I mean, that would happen here if we gave, as much as we try to empower our teams, if we were to ask each of them to prepare a budget, I think they would all be intimidated.
Start to sweat, yeah.
And in this industry, marketing is such a small portion of the budget. It's like 2%, 3%, that they even probably have less impact and less exposure to, like, how a property is or isn't budgeted. So they're kind of almost often an afterthought. Like, yep, here's your few ducats, go spend them. So at first, we witnessed people thinking about evenly spreading it, because that's pretty typical. Take it, divide by 12. But then I saw different people where they were following the jeweler example and some where they didn't. I will say, like, I think we budgeted like an hour and a half for that budgeting session, and we ran out of time. Like, it just showed like how complex this is, even with your 24 sticky notes that don't, whatever, it's just an exercise, right? Of how long it took a group to try to come to a consensus, and they really couldn't come to consensus. As far as your question of would it be different, I think it would be almost a repeat. Like, it'd be kind of fun to do again at this year's summit, just to see if it would be a repeat or not. But I feel like it would be the same thing. That
saddens me a little bit, but I think you're probably right. I don't recall whether we got too specific, like at meaning platform. And the easy divide here is ILS versus digital advertising. And then you kind of have the other bucket, some still spending on the sign acrobats, but whether you would expect that to also look similar, or if, you think it would be apartments.com and nothing else, or would it be more diversified, more performance based? I mean, Apartment List was just starting to make its name in 2019. Zillow's obviously made quite a few changes to try and be more appealing for the multifamily versus single family. And then, of course, Rent now is putting a lot more attention at being a full service, I guess, 360 solution, their marketplace or whatever, listings plus digital advertising. And there are even some new platforms, TikTok at the top of that list. So I don't recall us getting super specific as far as the actual media mix, but do you think that too would be fairly similar? Do you think there'd be bigger changes there?
We didn't, and that was what was kind of amusing about it. It was as simple as you have 2 sticky notes, right? And we got confused, let alone if you layer 9 or 10 platforms on top. Yeah. How do you do it? I think we would see a slight change there, because what I'm hearing from my interviews is folks getting more upset with ILSs and wanting to say, never mind, or pulling back from it. Of course, I there's no way that like a CoStar hasn't done the math and say, yep, we can raise prices 5%. We're going to get 2% churn, so it's worth it. Like, that's what we would be advised if we were doing a SaaS pricing exercise, for example. So I think proportionally, you probably see more of the properties on ILS spending more on ILS. That said, I think there are probably new platforms in the mix overall that people didn't have before. Like, again, I'm hearing more people talk about TikTok or programmatic audio, or it almost feels like the buzzword of the year is email. I feel like I'm just constantly hearing people talk about email now.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the other part of that, and this isn't about putting together, in the classic sense, I guess, a budget, an advertising budget. I'll be more specific, but is what amount is allocated now for marketing and ad tech? So a knock, just using
Right.
this example, but a perk,
Yeah.
a meet a lease, the email providers, Nurture Boss, etc. Because not all this falls or folds into the same buckets, right? When they're budgeting, and many of them, I think, try to get creative or leverage that as much as they can, so that they can find ways to pay for things that may not be classic lead gen. And then SEO. Right now, I know you've been spending a lot more time with listing management, citations, etc. And then, we've also had some clients, that are showing some interest in call analytics. So do you think that I'll call it a slush fund, but that's probably not fair for a lot of people out there, but the allocation for their tech stack is also probably similar? Do you think that they're starting to put more money aside for that because they see all the either gains or the need just to be testing and putting more money into technology?
I think they are getting a bigger budget from what I've seen for technology. Now, what's been really surprising to me is it feels like the accountability chart, if you will, of marketing, meaning using an EOS term. So what is marketing responsible for? It feels like that's getting abused a little bit to me, where people are just like using marketing budget saying, oh, we need this chat bot, go ahead and put it in marketing. But in reality, a chat bot it's not marketing, right? The bot is responding. It's taking load off your leasing agent. So I don't really understand why that's considered marketing. I think marketing to me is more of the outward, than the inward. Now, if the chat bot was like, I don't know, somehow like getting users like a call to action on the website or something, but that's not typically what those chatbots do. They're there as a tool, for someone to engage with quickly versus talking to a leasing agent. So to me, I feel like those belong more on the ops side. Same with like these email responders or, even listing citations is interesting because it's like if you were, let's say you didn't have a marketing department, would you still want to be on Google Maps? Yeah, you'd be like, I have to be on Google Maps. It's
Sure.
like being in the Yellow Pages.
Sure.
Now, if you didn't buy an ad in the Yellow Pages, and you just got the basic free listing, that to me is ops. Like, I got to make sure that my phone line's connected and my address is correct on Google Maps, right, or in the Yellow Pages.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you buy a full page ad or a double truck, like, sure, yeah, that's marketing budget. That's different now. We're trying to generate leads. So that makes sense to me. Like your Google ad spend would go into marketing. But as far as like your listings management, that to me seems like a function. It's like the electricity, basically. So I've witnessed marketing it feels like it's getting taken advantage of a lot because they don't know where else to put this, or maybe it's more of a capacity. Like we don't trust the on-site team to roll this out or to manage this. They're overwhelmed. So let's just give it to marketing, kind of how we've done at different times where Reid has to take on HR or something because we don't have someone dedicated for it.
Yeah, totally. Well, if you were an owner of a building, if this is fair to ask, how much autonomy do you feel like you would be comfortable with? And not just with the marketer, but across the board. And so I'm going to be more specific. If success for you felt like 6%, NOI, and we said the team, okay, we got it. And I'm not okay with anything below 4%. Pretty, narrow range, but like I said, these percentages are much more significant when you're talking about hundreds of $millions or sometimes. Can you imagine yourself offering that kind of empowerment or autonomy, or would that freak you out?
I would probably not start there. I mean, you know me very well. I am very much about setting expectations. And so what are my expectations of the property manager? And if I've set my expectations that they're going to manage budget within 3%, cool. Then I don't mind like giving the autonomy because I've set expectations. If I haven't been super clear about expectations, then I feel like I would be way more like controlling as far as writing the budget and then just to remove like the finger pointing and also the qualifications. I mean, I said this to Ryan internally in our internal meeting, but we have first-time managers that we're asking to produce a budget, and we have not given them training on what that means to produce a budget. And they're figuring out when to have disciplinary conversations, let alone how to build a budget. So my question to Ryan is like, what's a fair expectation for a first year manager? Like, should they know how to build a budget, or do we need to give them training first? He's like, oh, they probably need some training. It's like, cool, great. So that to me means they don't have signing authority on it because they haven't been trained. They haven't showed that they have that they're capable. Unless that's our expectation, now we need to hire for that. And then we shouldn't be hiring any first time managers because they don't have the background. So that's how I would take it. If I was coming in and inheriting a group, I would first probably have more control, and then like spend my first year setting expectations of what I thought about each role. Mm-hmm. And then again, then once you set expectations, you must be willing to manage to those expectations. So now I must be willing to do something about it if someone can't. If I'm trying to give them autonomy to, if it's a property manager and it's like, yep, you make the call when we replace the roof or when you repave the driveway. Mm-hmm. It's like those are big ticket items. Like, do I really want, someone in their mid-20s possibly like making a decision on a $500,000 roofing job? Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Well, I don't also recall, because you ran the workshop, whether your customer acquisition costs or your cost per lease was a theme back to like the metrics or how they go about this, or what does success look like. I mean, that's what prompted it when you were telling me that you would be really clear up front, and then they could eventually maybe earn more trust and autonomy on what success looks like. And I know this may take us back even further into the conversation when you were saying not everybody is motivated or incentivized by the same thing. But typically, what do you think success is deemed or deemed by, like when it comes to the multifamily marketer? Their quarterly conversations, or annual reviews. Do you think that NOI comes into play? Do you think CAC is part of that? Do you think it's occupancy based? Do you think it's just feedback that they get from the stakeholders, surrounding marketing? What's your speculation on how these annual reviews look for marketers?
I've actually had conversations about this and asked, and from what I've gathered from people is it's not based on CAC or NOI or occupancy. It's none of that stuff. It really is kind of their internal brand to say like, oh yeah, this person's doing a bang up job. Like everyone likes them. They don't cause any problems.
They're on top of their shit.
Yep. And then it's always many of these marketers are actually bonused. Like there's a discretionary bonus that these companies can give the marketer. It's on the who's ever in charge of the department to decide how much of the bonus they get, what percentage. Let's say 3 to 6%, and that bonus is usually determined, it seems, based off of projects. Oh, you did these 3 extra strategic projects. Yep, I'm going to give you. You didn't get. Nobody was complaining about you. You handled 40 properties and you did 3 strategic projects. You're getting 4%, and so it really starts to feel like more of a political game at that point, because it's like, how do they remember what project you were doing? Were you good at championing your project or like marketing it internally, to get celebration on it? And then, it's like, well, yep, nobody fired me over, property 47 that was really struggling this year. It's like, we're just going to chalk that up to like seasonality, right? It feels like they're just like, seasonality. It's such a,
which, hearing you say that, if in fact that's mostly true, even that screams to me like lack of belief and or understanding, right, from the operators. Meaning, if they're comfortable with bonuses and reviews that aren't really data based, like performance based, related to the property, NOI, occupancy, how effective you are at generating leads, which would be more the CAC, then they're kind of marginalizing it. I don't know another way of putting that, where it's like you're going to focus on projects, but, I play a key role, clearly maybe more than you recognize, in the performance of the property. And so, like I said, it seems to me that either they don't believe in marketing as much as they should, otherwise that would be a very different conversation, or they just overlook it because the budgets are so, I guess in the grand scheme of things, it's just not something that gets a lot of attention, or they just don't understand, meaning the value of marketing and advertising, where it's like, oh, actually the choices you guys do make, the strategy you're putting together, the sophistication, frankly, that now is needed to compete is really important. And therefore, I'm going to stop bonusing you on projects, and I'm going to start bonusing you actually on performance of the building.
Yeah, I know some of the cause for this effect, but I'll just whatever.
BC here.
No. Where I'm going is, but our paid media team, is their increased salary based on their performance at a property level?
No, and I feel pretty secure in my answer to that. And maybe this, I don't know if they've thought about this as much, but one of your favorite statistics, and I don't know, speaking of things that have changed or haven't in the last 3 or 4 years, but is 50, sometimes 60% of calls aren't answered, at the property level. What is a paid media strategist supposed to do about that? What are they supposed to do if a leasing agent isn't very effective at closing? What are they supposed to do if there's an economic downturn, or if 3 new buildings just opened up across the street and they're running crazy concessions? There's so much that a paid media strategist has no possibility of controlling. And so bonusing them on that seems really difficult. So is that the exact same argument, which isn't what, at least you started with, on why that's not the way that it's approached, in the industry with marketers, like on annual reviews and quarterly conversations? I would actually accept that far more, but I do think you could normalize that picture and still be more data driven in how you're evaluating a marketer in multifamily and feel good about it. But I'm just being directly responding to the paid media strategist.
We could do the same thing though, right? Like if we were critical of our own, is we could be more data driven with how we're
I don't
evaluating
disagree with that. But those realities are pretty significant as far as how much we could emphasize the performance of the building.
Yeah, I'd say it depends, right? Like I view it like, what's the handoff for a paid media person to the property? To me, it's like, we sent you the phone call, so it led the horse to water, right? And for the marketer on the property management side, I would say the same thing, is like, hey, I worked with these vendors, they send you X amount of leads. I can't answer the phone for you, right? So if I was to take that approach of like, here's my core job and let's be clear about it. Now, I'm not saying now let's get really political and put up walls and not be a team player. Definitely be a team player, but let's just be real about what someone's responsible for. I think a lot of the reason though is why it's also tough for our paid media people here is each owner can set their own goal. So just how I said you have 50 different Ryans asking you to budget for the year, you have the 50 different Ryans telling you what they want. Do they want leads, or do they want to sell 2 bedrooms, or do they want quality leads, or do they just want number of leads or brand awareness? Because you have 50 different folks, there's no easy way to keep track of that to say, yep, totally, you were hitting your goal 90% of the time. It's that kind of number. I'd like to do something like that, right? Like you met your customer's goal 90% of the time. Mm-hmm. A+, met my mark. So it's, as we went into this with our own accountability chart, it's funny because it seems so easy and yet it's so complicated.
Yeah.
I do have one question sort of in that vein for you. Running sales departments, did you guys, part of it is like, hey, top line revenue, give me that. Was there ever pushback about yeah, but you're bringing me garbage, not good fit clients that are causing more effort behind the scenes, blah, blah, blah. Because that's kind of the argument, right? Of I want quality leads, not just garbage leads. I could have seen the same thing that you could have dealt with in sales.
Not really. It was just show me that top line. I think maybe once, and that would take me all the way back a year and a half to Verizon. Actually that wasn't, I don't want to expose too much, but that was in play, maybe one other company for me, as far as the profit share, which would tie to what you're saying. It's like skipping to the end there. But generally speaking, it was just, bring me as much top line as you can. And because I worked mostly for media companies and local media, they were all, scrambling, where it was we can't afford right now to be thinking about margin. We're getting the crap beat out of us because all these digital, all the digital that's hitting. And I was supposed to help sell that, and promote that. So they were like, go get it. We don't really care. But you do know, towards the end of my stint at the Post, that became a huge issue, as more specifically the not the clientele, but the actual margin of what we were selling, the owned and operated versus, because it was like, and I had warned, multiple times, I was like, trust me, when you start looking at this, you're going to realize that this isn't a winning strategy.
I did wonder about that though, because obviously you worked with a lot of other smart people that were good with numbers. So when you would raise it before, meaning there's less margin on Google ads than there is on print newspaper, did they just totally not respond to you or ignore your cries for wolf, if you will, or sky is falling, chicken little? Or how was because they should have seen that, oh, we're making 20%, of course.
Yeah, I think it was with, I don't want to call it the false hope, because I did see this more in Austin than I did here in Denver, as far as the results, like digital being more incremental versus cannibalizing. And I think that's what started to really happen here, and was happening with more probably papers, just based on the time period. Like with each year, it felt like, it was getting harder and harder to defend, print budgets. And so there wasn't anything else to sell, and therefore that whole situation was just getting magnified, amplified. Mm-hmm. So it made sense. It was just kind of like, just the curve, if you will, that line. It was going to play out the way that it was playing out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of a good example for our audience, but I'm not coming up with a great one that would immediately connect to them. I'm thinking more about company valuations and such, but it would be I don't know, Tesla is being valued often on as if it's an AI company because of what self-driving cars may do. Mm-hmm. And when you pencil out the AI portion, you're like, oh, look at the margin on that. It's going to be phenomenal. And so then if their valuation's much higher than Ford's. So it's like, well, if they just bought Ford Motor Company, now we added, I don't know, $100 billion in revenue. So multiply that times 20, right? Because that's what Tesla's getting now. It's like, it doesn't exactly work like that, because at some point you have so much significant revenue coming from a different portion that your overall margin is brought down, and now you're not trading on a 20x multiple, but a 3x multiple. And so I could have seen something like that at the Post happen, where it's like, we'll take $500 of digital on a $20,000 print order. It doesn't really impact things, but very quickly when it reverses, total different story.
Yep. And that's what also led a lot of and I think it's probably the norm now, but is a lot of these local media companies, the digital sellers are selling outside of their own market to try and catch, offset that with bigger deals, more volume. Because if you were to just, try to exchange, full page ad for a search campaign, for one auto dealer, it's unlikely that you're going to get anywhere close to offsetting that. So it's like I need to sell more, and in order to sell more, I'm going to have to sell outside of my own market, which is a totally different skill set that most of the sellers I worked with weren't super effective at. You excluded.
All right, we're sort of moving further away from budgeting here, but I have another fun fact. I don't know if I shared with you, but when I was at Hearst, I was in the newspaper division, and we were this is 12, 15 years ago. But what was happening there is the local newspapers all had their own little website, obviously. And you were trying to sell direct, banner advertising on those websites, of course. But what you dealt with this many times too, Reid. I know we talked about your experience, but less mine. I remember at one point we were like, well, we don't really have enough. At first, we weren't selling based on impressions. We were just purely saying, you get this placement. And it was there was no reporting about I bought 100,000. It's just no, you were there at some point. Mm-hmm. And then we started getting pushed because programmatic advertising and patch was coming out and hitting us really hard on competing with local papers. So we had to start giving impression numbers. And for a while, our Stanford newspaper was doing really well, high quality journalism, website traffic. And then it was shoot, we got to get more page views. And so what ended up doing really well were not listicles, but these, let's call them, I think we did call them slideshows, but it was this week in events. And it would have you had to click to the right to see every new picture of events. And it was a new page load that would then load new impressions. And
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay. And then what they ended up finding was that bikini contest did really well at the arena. Mm-hmm. Let's put some more bikini contest event photos up on the Stanford website because we'll get more clicks. And I'm like, do you guys not see where this is going? You cannot just do more bikini photos to get more ad impressions. Like that is, you're getting very far away from the point of the newspaper.
100%.
And we couldn't stop it. I ended up leaving before that totally came to a head, but I was like, this is quickly going the wrong way.
It is, or it was, and it is. I think the dilemma, for papers, in particular, more so because they hold themselves to a higher standard. Earmuffs for anybody that is on the journalistic side of TV or radio, but we're always seen as the watchdogs having the highest sense of integrity, and then the bikini, costume or whatever contest, is put online and it drives a bunch of revenue. What do they do with that when they find out that the company needs to hit a certain EBITDA target, and if they don't allow that, then that may mean that they lose one of their columnists or journalists. Same difference, but that was very real. And even when I was in Austin before I think it had fully blown up, like within the industry at large, each writer was getting measured on their own page views. So not, the bikini contest that might be next to their article, but, how much did they generate? Which was a huge jolt, where it's like, wow. But at the same time, I kind of understood it. It's like, as smart as that writer is, and, those are incredible op-eds, if only, 1,500 people are reading them versus somebody else that's writing about, whatever the topic may be, and they're getting 15,000.
Mm-hmm.
Aren't those the choices you have to make?
There's a big thing with Business Insider on the same topic right now, where Business Insider, as it was up and coming, switched to a performance-based model for their writers.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and at first it seemed like it was taking really well, but then over time you have this unintended consequence where you just end up getting like clickbaity, writers, because obviously all they need is the click. There doesn't need to be substance, and then that degrades the brand, and now all of a sudden you don't have people subscribing to Business Insider. And then I don't know that this actually happened yet, but there's a lot of rumors about them unionizing, and it's like, well, that's a problem too with unionization about the writers when they're performance based, and the ones that are like doing really well and have found like, how do I provide high quality and get a lot of traffic, they maybe don't want to take that union deal that these other folks want, that are not getting as many clicks and haven't found the quality.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways,
yeah, well, I'm going to try and bring us all the way back, and also know that we're going to wrap this up. But something that has not really taken root, and we'll own this to a degree because we tried to solve for it. But I'm just curious how surprised you are, whether it was Fiona or whether it's some other AI platform. Why hasn't that gained more traction in the industry, where it's like there's too many variables? This is going to take way too much time, to your point about 30 or 50 Ryans, like going through this. These days with the advancements, in AI, machine learning, data science, etc., shouldn't I just have an easy button here that can just solve this for me? It seems absurd to be spending 6 months on this, having all these different stakeholders, knowing the business is going to move. At what point does technology take over for budgeting in multifamily?
Well, the short answer is, isn't that what Davidoff's company is working on? Is a budgeting platform. I think.
Sorry, that's not funny.
I think the
not funny at all
with him is that he's attacking it from like all in, like all budgeting versus just marketing. So I think that was one of the challenges with Fiona, is like, this doesn't now integrate with whatever Excel sheet or whatever they're doing.
I'm paranoid right now. Can I? Not that he's listening, but I just want to be fair. The reason I chuckled is just implying that Davidoff and this is going to solve for all this. Yeah. But you're just jumping into who's currently working on solving this problem. Yeah. So
the other thing I'd say, though, is this hasn't been solved outside of multifamily. And as we've said, multifamily is lagging behind. So if it hasn't been solved for the Digibles of the world, why would we now spend all this R&D to solve it within multifamily? Or how could we be so cocky, I guess, right, that multifamily is going to get this done before the general market? So I do see this as a huge still opportunity gap within the overall, all companies like budgeting. If you remember, even back in when we first started, I think it was like businessplan.com or whatever, when we were first forecasting, that had a very easy, lightweight calculator that allowed you to project forward multiple years and make some basic assumptions. And that at the time was like, holy cow, why doesn't this exist outside of building your original business plan? Now it should match up with actuals. So Yeah, short answer is they haven't solved it elsewhere. It's like attribution. Why would multifamily solve attribution ahead of
Right,
anything else?
right. So do you think then 5 years from now, we'll be more or less in the same spot as far as the amount of AI that is fueling or determining budgets? Or do you think that it will take a quantum leap forward, not just because of Davidoff, but because this is going to become more of an expectation? And I don't know whether that's marketing specific or the whole operating budget, but it just seems really hard for me. And I do this all the time. But if I were to say in 2050, do you think that AI is going to be determining budgets? You'd probably say, of course it is. I hope you would, but and I just keep coming back. So it's like,
Yeah.
how far out do you think this
I think
is?
5 years is too quick. This industry moves too slow. Like change, as we talked about with, I forget who our guest was on recently, but they were saying that only, you can only really do change management on like 2 or 3 systems a year. So budgeting is not going to be number one when there's not a number one solution out there where it's obvious, right? I'm frankly surprised that revenue management isn't more prolific than it is, and revenue management's now like 20 years old. So how can we not be doing dynamic pricing? On our own without human supervision, let alone like setting budget for a year. So 5 years is too quick, but definitely by 2050, I would expect, that us to have gone through that pain where we're getting help similar to revenue management. Revenue management doesn't just make the change without some oversight. I think it's going to be similar. Like there will be changes with some oversight.
Yep. It is a good question about revenue management. Like, why isn't it more ubiquitous? If there is such a thing as more ubiquitous, but why isn't it ubiquitous? And it has to be either one of two things. It is not actually as much of a no-brainer, meaning it doesn't work on every single property, or it is horribly marketed.
Right.
Because I just think this is black and white. It's like if overwhelmingly the majority of properties that use revenue management are turning, better profits, NOI, getting to their occupancy faster, etc. I mean, talk about things that'll get you fired. It's like, we should have been on that 6 months ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of two, right? And I feel like at some point, I hope that's where we are with marketing, like meaning using AI and helping like shape these budgets where it's just so clearly like makes sense. But that's what I would agree will still take some time. It's not going to happen next year. So I think you're probably right as far as another 5 years, we'll see some progress, but not a huge leap forward.
Well, this is fun. Doing a budgeting podcast we don't do it every year, but we should. Next time we can get someone on that's willing to.
Yeah, we have to bring somebody on for this one for sure.
But all right, well, we'll report back on how Digible's changed the budgeting.
Yep.
Positive or negative.
God bless you, Ryan.
Yeah. Hope you guys enjoyed. See you later.